morning. And just thank you for having me. Thank you, Elise and Glenn and Chris and Caroline and all the others from the Urban Sites Network and from the Boston Writing Project for having me here. And I was thinking about the conference theme, and my favorite word in that theme is nurture. And I was thinking about all of the kind of intellectual rigor and demand that goes into that concept of nurture, but then all of the love and belief and faith and things that we heard about last night. And if I think about my 19 years in teaching, you can't be effective without either of those, right? You have to have the technical proficiency that the writing project demands, but you also have to have that belief that you actually are teaching geniuses and that you can bring genius out of them. It's also rewarding to be back here. Many people know about my earlier affiliations with BOP and my teacher training program. And in 1992, when I was looking at credential programs and I was thinking which one I was going to go to, the reason I selected Berkeley, one, I grew up in Oakland, I wanted to come back, but two is because the Bay Area Writing Project was there. And I thought that that was like a very exciting place to be, and it didn't disappoint. You know, being there with some amazing teachers who shared their expertise with us, who held very high expectations for us in that credential program, who told us that you have to have students writing at a time when other people were not necessarily so focused on writing. So it's amazing to come full circle. And I woke up this morning thinking about a name that I hadn't thought about in quite a while. My mentor teacher at Oakland High School, Marcia Sattersfield, who was dying of cancer and had only months to live when she was my mentor teacher. And she could have done a lot of other things with the last months of her life, but she decided that she wanted to teach, and she wanted to teach me how to teach. And she once said, teaching is my ministry. It is what I do. And I think, 19 years later, she did not survive until Labor Day that next year. She passed away, and I actually took over her classes. But that's the caliber of person that I've been associated with through this program over the last 20 years. So it's a privilege to come here and talk about what I've been doing and how I've been in conversation with that early introduction ever since. So what I'm going to talk about is navigating urban literacies, how we make connections between the genius that we see in these literacy practices out of school and the demanding literacy practices that we want to see inside of school. And I'm going to talk about a number of different kinds of projects that I've been involved with over the last 18, 19 years. But I'm going to start with maybe how we can reconceive of the challenge that we face, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the guiding ideas behind this work, and then I'll share a number of examples. So one of the things that we have to come to terms with is the history of this institution that we work within called urban schools, right? This is a picture of an American factory circa 1911, and when I show this to my 6-year-old son, I say, what does it look like? What does it look like? A classroom, right? This is where it comes from, right? Why all those desks are in rows, right? And why there's about 30 of them in a room, and why you're released with a bell, right? You know, from class to class. That it comes from this idea that we're preparing working class kids and immigrants for working class jobs, right? The factory model of schooling. Only if you think about that factory, right, even if our only purpose was to train people for the world of work, that factory has changed considerably over the last 100 years. Right? And we think about Americans at work in 2010 or 2011, it's multimodal, right? Instead of facing forward like those women were in the picture, people are facing each other, right? There's dialogue going on. There's multiple texts that are interacting at the same time, right? People are working from home, right? All over the place. The factory can be in your bed if you've got internet access, right? Or even here at one of the tables, if you're tweeting or online right now, you could be working and pretending to listen to me. It's all right. I had to turn my phone off from so I won't be texting or tweeting while I'm up here too. But the world has changed, right? It's changed dramatically. If you think about even art and activism, right? For those of us who see other purposes of schooling besides preparing workers, right? That world has also changed. That world is interactive. That world is multimodal. These are international pictures that I took, not just in the United States. However, one thing has remained terribly the same. The American classroom in 2010 looks remarkably similar to the classroom of 1910. And one of the only differences is that one picture's in color and the other one's in black and white. But we have to think about, if the world is changing, and if our task is to prepare kids for the world, to be more powerful inhabitants of the world, then maybe we have to think differently about what we do, right? And that's where I start, right? We have to be willing to innovate, and we have to be willing to think differently because the world is a different place. Our kids are different people than they were 100 years ago. They have different technologies, they have different experiences, and education should start with the experiences of young people and help them to become more powerful at what it is that matters to them and what will matter to them in the future. So I think about that, and I also think about writing as starting with voice, right? These experiences, these narratives. Everyone has a story to tell. And writing, as the provost of UMass Boston said last night, is a part of what makes you be able to tell those stories more powerfully. So I just want to show a little clip of a video that my students made a couple summers ago. By my students, I mean the high school students that I work with. And this will kind of set the tone for how I'm going to talk about voice and writing and new technologies in the work that I've been doing with teachers and with students in Los Angeles.
Our struggles can be understood. All we ask is that you listen to what we have to say, because what we speak are our truths.
Okay. That's a much longer video where they talk about some of the inequities in their school, and I'll talk later about all the different kinds of written and new media texts that are involved in this process of filmmaking, but it's the quote at the end. You saw some images. Those images were from Watts. Those images were from East Los Angeles. And at the end, the young woman, Beverly, she says, all we ask is that you listen to what we have to say, because what we speak are our truths. And I think the conversation I've been having with young people for the past 19 years is asking them, what is it that you want to say? And how can we help you to say it more powerfully? Right? And then how can we embed all the kinds of things we want about writing instruction in that process of you saying what you want to say? So what does it mean to have voice? Having something to say. Young people are motivated to tell their stories. Young children learn to talk because they're motivated. They have something to say, right? They want to tell you, I'm sick of orange juice, right? Get me some apple juice. And crying is not working, so I better figure out this language, right? We literally, our voice develops from having a motivation to communicate, knowing how to say it. Right? Knowing how to say it powerfully. That if I say it in one way, it's much more likely to be effective than if I say it this other way. Right? That's where the literacy comes in. The technology of writing, to say it powerfully. To feel good about your identity, to say it. Right? One of the biggest challenges we face right now in education is not an ability crisis, it's an identity crisis. It's because young people feel like they can't say what they want to say. Not that they don't want to say it. And so we have to address that head on, the identity crisis that we have with our young people. Saying it with authority and power. I think it was the superintendent last night who talked about when we have voice, we're less likely to use violent means to communicate, right? Using voice instead of violence. And coming together. Dialogues and conversation, and how can that be mediated by writing? So if we think about these ideas of motivation, literacy, identity, achievement, anti-violence, and community, it's kind of coming together to form this foundation of these empowering writing pedagogies. So I just want to talk about a couple of guiding ideas that have been really powerful for me over my journey as an educator. This first one came to me when I was in graduate school at Berkeley while I was teaching at Oakland High School. And I was having a huge challenge with engaging students. And there were students that I knew were smart, students I knew were brilliant, but who were not connecting to what was happening in the classroom. And that was obviously my fault, but I did not know what to do about it. And it was tremendously disturbing to be a young teacher and know that you could do much better by these kids. And so I began taking classes at the university, and one of the classes that I took that really fascinated me was educational psychology. And there were a lot of different theories of motivation, but this is the one that really stuck for me, the expectancy value theory of motivation. It basically says motivation is a function of two characteristics. If these are met, students are likely to be motivated. If they're not met, they won't. The first one is confidence. To the degree that I feel confident in the task that I am asked to perform, I will be motivated to perform that task. Right? You can think about a lot of things that you may not like to do, but if you're confident in your ability to do it, you're motivated. Right? The second one is relevance. To the degree that an activity is seen as relevant, I will be motivated to do it. Right? And we can think of all sorts of examples, right? You try to find the 15-year-old that wouldn't be motivated to figure out how to program an iPad if you gave her one for Christmas, right? I haven't seen the 15-year-old that doesn't know how to use their cell phone or their iPad, right? Or who would admit that anyways publicly, because they're motivated to do it because it's relevant to them. So that kind of hit me like a ton of bricks. I was asking students to do something that they weren't confident in, and I was asking them to do something that they perceived as irrelevant to their lives. No wonder they weren't motivated, right? So I realized that, I'm not teaching English, I'm teaching somebody's daughter English. I'm teaching a child English, right? And I have to figure out what motivates her, right? What is she confident in? And what matters to her? And so that's when I came around to the popular culture. It wasn't because I loved popular culture, it was because I loved those kids. And I had to make a connection because they weren't learning any kind of English, right? It wasn't like I destroyed Shakespeare books. There was no reading going on, right? There was no writing going on. And to get them to Shakespeare, to get them to those academic literacies, we had to make connections to the popular culture because one, they had confidence in their ability to navigate this new digital world. And two, telling their stories about life in this world, the same way those young girls read those poems last night, telling those stories was highly relevant to them, to share with people what is happening in their world. So that's how you increase engagement. Figure out what they're confident in. Start with their abilities, right? Students as able, not students as disabled. And we know that, right? In the writing project, we know that. That's where true powerful learning begins. And have them say something that matters. Speaking about the inequities in your school keeps our students up to 11 o'clock at night because it's highly relevant to them, right? So that's an important idea to think about where powerful learning comes from. If you think about powerful teaching, one of the people who really inspired me is Paulo Freire, and he talks about true education must begin with the experiences of the people, right? That not the experiences of some far-off world, the experience of your world, right? Tell me about your block, and then maybe we can work our way to Mesopotamia, right? But if we start with Mesopotamia, that doesn't matter to you because no one ever told you the story about your own block. Or you can't tell the story about Pow Pow, right? What's happening on your block, in your neighborhood, right? So true education must begin with the experiences of the people. And the other thing Freire talks about is moving beyond this notion of a banking concept of education where we see the children as empty receptacles and come and open their heads and deposit knowledge, but rather thinking about education for critical consciousness as being about problem posing, right? And I think about my life as a writer, and writing is about problem posing, right? The problems of content, but also the problems of substance. Like, how do I say this sentence more powerfully, right? Posing these problems to yourself as a writer is how you get better at writing. So this is really important. We think about theories of learning, around empowerment and engagement, theories of teaching, around voice, about experience, about solving problems, being an agent of change, and thinking about how your writing mediates that. And the third major idea really informs this work is culturally relevant teaching, the work of folks such as Gloria Ladson-Billings and Sonia Nieto and many, many others. But Gloria talks about culturally relevant teaching. Students must experience academic success. They must develop and or maintain cultural competence, right? That we can create a synergy between home, school, community, neighborhood, and family, right? It does not have to be a disconnect, right? That all those voices can come together because they're all coming together in the lives of the students we teach, right? And students must develop a critical consciousness through which they challenge the status quo of the social order, right? We teach in urban America that has an implicit critique of the social order, right? And our students have that implicit critique of the social order because they understand why they are all there. That's a powerful narrative to begin thinking about developing a powerful writing pedagogies, right? It's no secret to them. And our students will ask, how come we're all on this side of the bridge? And how come they're all on that side of the bridge with the skyscrapers? Every urban city in America has that same dynamic, right? From some hood, you're looking at skyscrapers that you don't have access to unless you're going to clean it, right? Right? And that's how it was when I grew up. And that's how it is today, right? In these same neighborhoods. So you think that should be a part of writing instruction, right? That should be a part of the stories that the kids want to tell, right? That's culturally relevant. And yes, they get to essays, they get to these poems, right? They get to the blogs, they get to all the good, meaty, content standard stuff. But it starts with their lives, right? And narrating the story of my life can be the essence of this powerful pedagogy. So how this all comes together is what I call my powerful teaching 4.0, the core principles: voice, affirmation, achievement, purpose, and love. Right? When we think about the what of teaching and the why of teaching, I also think about the how, helping students to say what they want to say, building their confidence, being relevant to their lives, honoring their cultures, their families, their neighborhoods, and communities. Affirm, right? Affirmation, pushing students beyond their expectations of themselves. We know that they are capable of genius. Right? They can write at high levels. Just like that band was playing last night in here, I was thinking, that's how students can write too. Right? The same way the saxophone player and the keyboardist and the bass, they can write like that too. Right? And we know they can. Right? So we have those expectations beyond what they can think of themselves. And these last two, we don't talk about so much. Students create work products and are involved in projects that have an impact on their local communities and the world. Purpose. Purpose matters. A purpose for this writing. Right? Can there be a purpose right now, today, in this second grade class, or this fifth grade class, or this seventh grade class, or this 12th grade class? Can our writing serve a purpose today? Right? And the final one is love. And it's not just about us loving them. It's about allowing them to share the love they have with the world through the text that they create. There's no population that is more capable of love than our young people. It is a matter of survival. Right? Psychologists will tell you that. Young people have to develop this tremendous capacity for love because they have to trust people before adults would so that they can learn and they can survive. Right? It's not about inspiring kids. It's about giving them the opportunity to be inspirational to others and they become inspired. Right? Let them be the inspirations. Let them share the love. Right? And then the identity begins to shift. They say, oh, well, I can help these people. Right? It matters to them if they hear me tell my story. Right? So we need to think about that, how these all come together. So what I'm going to do now is just share a number of examples in classrooms, out of classrooms, across K-12, of how this has come together for me and the teachers I work with and the students I work with in Los Angeles and all over the country. So the first set of projects I'm going to talk about are about incorporating popular culture in the classroom and some of the things we've been doing since the publication of that first version of the book. So one thing I try to do is define popular culture as being much more broad than what people think. I love that picture of Homer Simpson. That we think about popular culture as documents, artifacts, films, videos, magazines, right? There's a documentary component to popular culture, and that's the one we talk about the most. But I also think about popular culture as ideas, values, attitudes, right? That there's an ideal component to it, right? When young people are forming their values, their attitudes towards society, a lot of this is mediated by popular culture, and it's not what you can see, right? And you have to look beyond just the documents you can see. And the third element of popular culture is constantly being kind of reframed and remixed, and it is this everyday life and language. Right? So the popular culture, I think you should invert this list, right? It begins with the everyday life and language. And there's this dialogue between students' worlds and the production of popular culture. And so we need to think about students as producers of popular culture, right? That's why this list is important. We can't just think of them as consumers or popular culture hitting them on the head. They are popular culture, right? They are producers of culture, producers of knowledge. And we need to tap into that, one, so that they become more critical producers of that popular culture, but two, that they also see themselves as cultural producers. That's a part of that identity shift, right? And that the process of writing, more than any other scholarly activity in schools, is a productive one, right? I think we've gotten this much earlier than others. You have to produce, right, to be a writer. But we have to see how students are already producers, right, and tap into that mode of production that is a part of their everyday cultural activity, and then think about how we readjust what we do in classrooms to connect with that, right, because they are producing culture. So we know what the argument for popular culture is, so I'm just going to go through this very quickly. It's relevant to the young people's lives. It is intellectually rigorous. We were on the radio, and I think all my radio partners are here, right? Lynx is here, and Chris is here, and Caroline's here. Elise is here, right? And so we were talking about this. Glenn is here, who is also on that show. People say it's not rigorous, right? If you break this down, right, the activities that young people are involved in when they are producing popular culture at high level, this is an intellectually rigorous practice, and we need to document that, and we need to draw on that. Teaching popular culture can make connections to academic texts and concepts. So Linksa was talking about connecting Death of a Salesman to hip-hop, right? And the students were looking at similar themes, and many of us have done this kind of work where we juxtapose the popular culture text with these canonical texts, and students are able to have much more rich discussions and bring their own world into the discussion. And I argue that popular culture can be the lens through which they look at these canonical texts, right? That it allows for more empowered literary reading. So there's not an either or. Popular culture can facilitate the critical readings of the world of today's youth. And that's another skill. We talk about civic engagement. It's a survival skill for young people to be able to critically interpret the messages they receive via the media, right? That is a matter of life and death. And so we have to be more cognizant of our role in that and helping them to think about how they can critically interpret that, but then how they also have the tools to rewrite that world, right? You don't like the media you receive, create another one, right? You don't like the messages that are being sent about you, create your own messages. And that's why you need to learn these tools of writing and production. And we know that young people are motivated to learn popular culture outside of school. They're also motivated to learn popular culture inside of school. So what does this look like? Here's one unit on critical youth media literacy, and this is from a 9th grade classroom in East Los Angeles. And these are some of the images that I'm talking about that kids are dying over their inability to critically interpret. Our young girls and our young boys, right? If we don't engage the source of these images, if we don't talk about what they do to the identity development of our young people, then we are not giving them the tools that they need to effectively make sense of this kind of world, right, with these kinds of images for especially young women and men of color. So in this unit, one of the things that we want the students to do is develop a critical consumer perspective of the media, but also become critical producers. Right? And this includes writing as we think of it traditionally, but writing in all sorts of other ways. And this is a part of what these 9th graders in East LA are doing. So we start with kind of some of the critical consumption, analyzing cultural artifacts. We think about these questions. When you look at a cultural artifact, what ideas or values are promoted? What does it mean to be cool? What does it mean to have power? What does it mean to be desired? And what does it mean to be marginalized or othered? And we also ask, how is the audience or recipient constructed in these media? Because that's important, right? When you're writing, you're constructing an audience, whether it's a television commercial or whether it's an essay, right? So you think about if you're watching Dr. Phil, this is audience participation here, right? If you're watching Dr. Phil at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, or Oprah, who was formerly on around that time slot, what kind of commercials are you going to see? Pharmaceutical. Women's products. Self-help, right? Mop and glow, right? Mr. Clean, that sort of thing, right? So you know how the audience is constructed. Now, if you're watching the Super Bowl, how many of those same commercials do you see? So what do you see at the Super Bowl? Beer. See, that's a beer, right? BMWs, John Hancock retirement, right? So you're being constructed as an audience, right? And same thing if you're watching Nickelodeon, my 6-year-old, he watches TV on Saturday mornings when he doesn't have a track meet. He runs in our room every commercial and asks for a new product. Right? Like, where are you getting these things from, right? You know, it's Nickelodeon. They know who their audience is, right? And you go from the kid to mom and dad. So we ask these kinds of questions in the context of images like this. And so I ask you, how many images like this are young people exposed to during their formative years? It's a number in the 7 or 8 figures, right? Millions. Television commercials, magazine ads, billboards, right? Lunch pails, backpacks, even though they have those like screens in the schools now, right? Where they're just mediating this kind of stuff, right? So we know, and I think it was Caroline who said, when she said, our youth are being bombarded with popular culture, right? It is this, right? It is this kind of popular culture that is being mediated through corporations to, I argue, tap into insecurities of young people so they become consumers as ways to mitigate their own insecurities, right? So we would go through something like this as a pre-writing activity with our young people. So you take the image on your left, right? What does that image say about what it means to be a young girl? White, blonde, thin, skinny, happy, long hair, right? So I can't leave the podium, but I normally run around. And so in your critical reading of this, take me to some of the semiotic images or some of the words that would bolster this argument. Like if you were going to write this out in an essay. Pretty hair. Okay, thank you. So sexy. All right, so you're ringers, obviously, right? So you got all of this stuff. With the kids, it would take maybe 15 minutes, but they would get there. The language, right? All of this is about being, so one of the theses you could write, if you're writing a critical essay on this, it's about being the object of desire, right? Being pretty, sexy, gorgeous. And my students tell me 17 magazine is not for 17-year-olds. By the time you're 17, you're done with 17 magazine. This is for 11, 12, 13-year-old girls, right, that are not even young women yet, that are aspiring to be 17 and look like this and go on a spring shopping spree and get the guy and interpret his messages, his IMs, right? It's humorous, but you know it's serious in a way, and it's also an intellectual activity to get them inside of this kind of stuff. And we look at tons of these magazine covers. They all have something about boy or guy. They all have something about being pretty, sexy, or gorgeous. They all have someone with perfect teeth, right? Someone with a $200 makeup job, right? And so to think about how you critically interpret this as a process of analytic writing is very important, right? Because right now, after that 15-minute discussion, you could get kids to write for 45 minutes an analysis of this, right? And they would write their thesis, and they would talk about the images, they would talk about the words, right? But you could also think about how you would turn into being a producer around this, right? So we have kids developing their own media campaigns, right? Their anti-media campaigns. Or what do you think an image of a young girl should be, right? So real quickly, if we look at the one on the right. All right, so what does this image say about what it means to be young men? Black, buff, violent. That's a big old gun, right? If you look at the distortion of this image, that gun is the size of his head, right? I mean, unless you are like firing a cannon or something, it's like this, right? And yes, all right, so he's got his cross, he's religious, or you better be religious if you're on the business side of that gun. But his cross is blinged out, right? It is a 6-figure cross, right? I mean, it's like studded in studs inside of studs in that thing, right? And the sweaty image of the black man comes from a very dark place in our history. And Fitty knows better, right? He can afford a shirt if he wanted to wear one. Right? I mean, the man has sold enough CDs, right? So it's not for poverty's sake that he can't, or adjusting temperature inside the room. His body is the cell, right? And the mean mug, and they both have very gendered expressions, right? The tough, disinterested, it's nothing personal, it's business, right? That I got to do what I got to do with this gun. And the young woman with her come hither look, as my students would call it. So there's a lot of writing in this, right? There's a lot of writing and breaking down these media images and reproduce. So this is where we start, right? And they get fired up about this because it matters to them, right? And you can have real conversations about the 99.9999, I would say 100%. I don't know any young girls or boys who fit up to these images that are 15, 16 years old. What it feels like to have those as ideals that you must contend with in your primary age of identity development is important for us. But also to give them the kind of tools, so let's create a blog, right? Let's create a newsletter, right? Let's come up with some other images for ourselves that we see as ideals. Is also an invitation. That's also part of what we do. Okay. All right, this is an example from younger kids kind of using Theater of the Oppressed to share stories about what's going on in the community, very similar to what we saw last night with the spoken word poetry, except for this is a teatro where students are engaged in a form of community theater where the audience can participate. The audience can kind of clap their hands and freeze actors on stage or move people around or come and interact. And so what it is the script becomes an interactive dialogue about community problems. And this is one about violence. These are students at a school in South LA. And they were in a neighborhood where many of them were experiencing this kind of violence the same way that the young 8th grader last night was talking about. So this is a picture of them at UCLA actually engaged in this act of teatro. So they started with a tableau, which is a frozen scene, and it ends up being a shooting. And there's a 7th grade boy who has been shot. He's laying on the ground, and so there's students all over the place kind of ducking behind things, and they all have these neat notebooks where they have written their script. And there's one 5th grader, she's the mistress of ceremonies, and she comes around and she taps each kid. As she taps them on the shoulder, they kind of break out of their pose and they read their story. And it turns out that it's a case of mistaken identity. That this kid, this 7th grader, on the way to school at the bus stop is shot. And the kids began to kind of mediate this dialogue with the audience. Why do you think this happens, right? And so it's everything from blaming the victim, it's because they got all these guns, selling all these drugs, and the kids kind of flip that script and say, well, where do the guns come from, right? There's no gun manufacturers in Watts. And the drugs aren't even indigenous to this continent, right? So they got to come on a plane, an automobile, a train, right? Someone with capital has to ship them in. They have to get past the government to get to our neighborhoods, right? So these 5th graders are running this show, right? And the audience is like, how do we tolerate this? Right? How do we stand by as America and allow this to happen? Right? These kids have been scoring off the charts in their reading scores and their math scores. We took a couple of these kids. We took almost 40 kids from LA to New Orleans a couple of weeks ago, and some of them were 6th graders that came out of this. Right? And they're doing research reports, and they're presenting to adults about how to change things in their neighborhood. Right? That's where motivation comes from. Because writing this story is about changing the life of someone I love. And whether it's through poetry, whether it's through drama, whether it's through a research report, right? We can get the genres in that we need to get in, but the story is the same. So here's an example of spoken word poetry. I'll take you through how we do that a little bit too. I think. All right, I'm not going to worry about it's a kid reading a poem. It's a cool poem, sorry. But I can show some examples. Hopefully the rest of the videos will work. Where we work on critical poetry, and the students, they talk about that. And the teacher will say, what does it mean to write a critical poem? And this is done from upper elementary all the way to high school. The kids say, a critical poem is about changing the world. Right? It's about looking at a problem out there, identifying that problem, thinking of solutions. They talk about engaging in critical analysis of poetry. So they do a lot of looking at how social messages are embedded in like hip hop poetry and other forms of poetry, but then also they're writing their own poetry. And so these are some examples of students that we took with Antero. We took these students to the Digital Media and Learning Conference in San Diego. And this young boy who was very, very shy, he spoke in front of a group that was about this size, and he was reading this poem, and you look at the third stanza, he says, "My uncle went to jail as a teen. He did the stupidest things I've ever seen. I was so close to following his every step, could have had so much street rep, but I'm leading my life toward a different story. I make sure people see me achieve glory. I'll be here forever. You know, I'm in my fall shot," right? So, and he talked about this poem as really helping him to come to terms with his own feelings about his past and how he was moving himself to a different future. And he expressed this in the analysis of his own poem in front of this audience of a couple hundred adults in San Diego. And this is an important part of poetry, right? And we were responding to Chris's students' poems, and they were so, where's Chris? Yeah, those poems, they were so honest and emotional, right? And I said, you know, to the one young woman I responded to, I said, this takes so much courage to write like this. But poets have to have that courage, because when we tell our stories in this way, we give people the power and license to think about their own stories in this way, right? To have power over those stories, right? Because once you put that story out, you can remove yourself from that story, right? You can analyze that story. You can change that story. But if you don't write it, if you don't get to see it, right, if it doesn't become flesh on the page, you may not be aware of those thoughts, right? So this is a student talking about rewriting himself through a poem. Right? I mean, you got to think, he is rewriting his life through his poem. Right? That's powerful. Here's another example, a beautifully illustrated poem, and it's also a beautiful poem by written by a 9th grade student. And, you know, her artwork here, you know, is kind of the analysis of the poem, and she's talking about hopelessness as being a product of blindness, because this woman's mind is fertile, right? She's got a garden growing out of her mind, but she can't see it. And that's where the hopelessness comes from. And she talks about this as a metaphor for hopelessness in her neighborhood, right? That it's knowledge that ends hopelessness, right? It's not so much a material change as it is an epistemological change, right? A change in your being, a change in your awareness. And that's how we eradicate hopelessness in the neighborhood, right? And so, you know, this is an amazing poem where she talks about there's a solution to this problem. The solution is knowledge, it's education. So a couple other examples that we also work with young people as media producers, right? And I have been for at least the past 7 or 8 years looking at the academic and the new media literacies that are embedded in this process, right? So making a video is not just about making a video. There's a lot of traditional reading and writing that goes into making the video, as well as the new skills that are developed. And I hope this one shows, because this one's kind of important to the... All right. I shouldn't have set myself up like that. It's showing the... It will not show. All right. No, I don't have another one in there. Okay. I promise at the end I will show some of these videos of the students because they're really amazing, and I don't know why I'm not getting them. Okay. But one of the things that we do when we look at the students, I know what when I show the YouTube page, I'll show a couple of videos of the students. That's in the second part of the presentation. But we look at the academic literacy skills that are developed through the documentary filmmaking, the background research they do, the different writing. And one of the things that I look at in the writing is all the process genres, right? The notes that they're taking, the interview transcripts that they're writing down, the protocols for the interviews, how they transcribe, that they're learning all these different kind of process writing strategies that are important for their success later on. One of the other things that we do to develop argumentative writing, when I first started teaching, a lot of my colleagues told me that their biggest problem in the writing was that the kids weren't writing very good argumentative essays, and now that's a big deal now with the new standards. And they said it was because kids don't know how to argue. I said, then I need your students, because my students clearly know how to argue. They argue everything, right? They argue everything. The challenge was they did not know how to convert the arguing that they did on a regular basis to the writing. And I needed to figure out how to make connections, and I remember thinking, what is the one popular cultural schemata that most closely approaches the kind of writing I want them to do? And I thought, the court trial, right? Many of them had various personal experiences with the criminal justice system, but all of them had experiences through popular culture, the criminal justice system. Every generation, whether it's Perry Mason, right? There's still some Perry Mason folks out there. That's all right. I caught it on syndication. I'm sorry, but we had LA Law, right? You know, for those of us, the 80s, and now they got Law and Order and CIS and NCIS and CIS Las Vegas and whatever those shows are, right? So the kids are always watching these shows, right? They all know how a court trial proceeds. And if you think about it, it makes sense in terms of the argumentative essay, right? You've got two sides. Both want to prevail in their argument, so they make an opening argument. They bring witnesses, right? The witnesses are cross-examined. The opposing side has witnesses. You cross-examine those witnesses, and you make a closing argument. And I think if my undergraduates did that on their papers, those would be A papers, right? That's an A-plus argument, right? And so they understand. I'm going to trial, right? I got no witnesses. That case is dead in the water. Right, that is dead in the water. So on their essays, they'd say, you got no witnesses, right? And they, got to bring witnesses. So what we would do around literary works or around popular themes is develop a short version, which would be like a 55-minute debate, all the way up through like a 1 week or 2 week court trial, where they play the witnesses' roles. They're the lawyers. They come up with the questions. They create these case books. And I have all these case books from all these years, and the case books are like 40, 50 pages long, and the kids are so proud of having done them, and they play this mock trial out, and their writing is beautiful. And it is beautiful writing in the analysis in these case books because they understand the argument, right? And whether it's over Bigger Thomas and Native Son, or we put Chaucer on trial in Canterbury Tales for libel for his portraits of the wife of Bath and the yeoman, right, and his sexist and racist language, and the knight and squire are defending him. And so, you can get creative with this. But the thing is, they understand argument. It's in there, right? It's in their repertoire of understanding, and we just have to figure out how to tap into it. The case books has been one of my favorite activities to do because argumentative writing and being able to write in this kind of persuasive way is so important to their navigation through secondary education into higher education. So this is something that has been, really an eye-opening experience. And I remember when we were doing it in Oakland, and we took some of these same ideas to the writing courses we were teaching at Berkeley, because those students were having trouble. And like, well, think of it like a court trial. And they're like, oh, yeah, they got it, right? And so then they started writing better argumentative essays. Right? So it's just one of those of where is the confidence? Kids were confident in their ability to do this oral language court trial, and we moved from their oral argument development to the written argument development in these essays that were part of their case books. Okay. So another example of having students write the story of their lives was this Critical Minds project. And we started this one with a group of students that were really low-tracked and at a school that had a high number of ninth graders exiting school early. And this was a class of those kinds of students. And working with a teacher who I had a long-term relationship with, and this was her first year of teaching, and we were talking early in the year about how to engage these students. And I said, well, what do they get excited about? And she said, what they mostly get excited about is talking about life growing up in East LA. So I said, we need to do a writing project around this. So we did this. We originally called it A Day in Our Life, or Day in My Life. And the kids renamed it the Critical Minds Project. And so we started with this prompt. And I had done it a few times with my high school students in the program I direct. And we give them a number of prompts. What do you first see when you wake up? What time do you wake up? What's your morning ritual? What do you eat for breakfast, right? How do you get to school? What do you see on the way to school? All the way through your periods and your breaks at school to home in the evening, right? And so I gave them these prompts, and the first time we did it, and it was a 2-hour block, and you could see the kids, they just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. And I remember one of the kids saying, no one's ever asked me about a day in my life, right? So then they constructed these essays about a day in their life. And they took them through multiple drafts, and then we brought these students up to the university, and they put on a major presentation for the people at the university. Then they decided they wanted to do a photo documentary. And so we got them disposable cameras and we digitized the images and they put them together into a digital story. Then they wanted to do a digital documentary, right? Then the teacher brought in all these other social texts so that they could see how their lives were kind of related to these larger social issues. They revised again. And this version here is these students who were kind of cast as non-writers at the beginning of the year were published writers. And this is our online journal. And we published all of those essays. And I remember looking at the students, they did this in Microsoft Word, and the teacher would have them number all their versions. And they were in the teens, like version 12, version 17, right? And wanting feedback because they knew that these stories were going to be published. And this is moving from a complete disengagement to students writing these 1,500, 2,000 word stories of their lives. And then we did a similar version of that here in Boston in a couple teachers' classrooms. And the students on their presentation day did it at like a reader's theater where they just read excerpts from their narratives. And they sat around the table and all the rest of us sat around them. And it went on for like 20 minutes. When they stopped, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. And I remember the headmaster saying, this is the most powerful thing I've seen in 25 years being an educator. Right? It was just young people telling their stories. Right? And this became a very kind of powerful way for them to see how writing could really be, life-changing, not just for you, but for the people who hear your stories. And so we have stepped that up with our young people. This is a blog that we have, and all the teachers out there who teaches secondary students, middle school students, high school students. All right, so please bring your students to our blog, all right? And this is our blog. It's called Young Critical Minds, right? And we have high school students all over Los Angeles, and they post what they're doing in their schools. So this is, we have to update it because this is last month, right before we went to New Orleans, and they need to talk about whether or not we accomplished our mission in New Orleans. Well, these are some of the kids, right? Each school, we have 4 or 5 schools, and each week, they take over a blog post. And this is these students have a video, and they're responding to Waiting for Superman. They talk about we're our own superheroes. They were one of the schools that was very negatively portrayed in Waiting for Superman. It was the part where the girl Daisy story, and they talked about the dropout factory, and she had to get to that KIPP school because God forbid she would have to go to Roosevelt High School. And this is Roosevelt High School. So every time they present now, these kids bust out their superhero shirts and like, we don't need Superman, right? Superman is here in our classrooms, in our bodies, right? So they speak back to that. And it's and they speak through writing, right? So they have a video blog, but this is written text, right? Thousands of words of text that these students are inspired to write and to share with others, because they want to tell their own narrative about their school that people write off as a ghetto school or dysfunctional. So you can see how this activity started as, we talked about the purpose of writing, right? It started as an activity to help students get engaged with the process of writing. Over the years, it's become an activity where students are sharing this story with others all over the country. And now, even further around the country, when you and all your students kind of jump in and chime in with Young Critical Minds, please do that. This is an example of multimodal text, and this is one of the videos that's on our YouTube page that I'll share in a bit, where the students are talking about how writing becomes a vehicle for social justice. And this is the title of their work, The Heart of the Revolution. They see themselves as revolutionaries because they should. Right? They're really changing things in their neighborhood. They're changing things in their school, and they're becoming powerful readers and writers in the process. Okay. One other thing that we do, this is another classroom-based project, is having students do oral histories of people in their neighborhoods and their families as a way of making connections to historical text and a way of making connections to their own family's histories. So we did this in Bless Me Ultima. We were struggling with this unit at the beginning, and the students were like, this 12-year-old in New Mexico not feeling it. And then we talked about being caught between being Mexican, Mexican-American, and America. Being caught between 2 worlds, 2 cultures, 2 languages. And had the students write these oral history interviews and conduct these interviews and transcribe these interviews and turn the interviews into essays, but also to do a PowerPoint presentation that they had to present, right? So there's the writing in the PowerPoint presentation, then there's the writing in these essays that they wrote based on these oral histories, right? And if anyone wants that, I mean, you can email me. I can email this to you, what we did here. And here's an example of one student's. And we also did this in their classrooms, and they did this for the department chair, the principal, but we brought them to the university and for one of my undergraduate classes, and they presented these oral histories. So this is Vanessa's. So you can kind of see how, she talks about her background, what her values are. That's her mom and dad and her little sisters. And this is an interview with her mother. One of the things her mother said is, I never had a chance to talk to my daughter about these issues until we did this oral history interview. So, we're facilitating this process of cultural transmission at the same time as we're developing these writing skills. And it was really powerful, because a lot of the parents were saying these kinds of things like, we never had the chance to get this kind of education. And it became a really powerful connector for the students to see how important their education was and the kinds of sacrifices people in their family had made and were continuing to make for them in their education. So she also did an older cousin, who's making these connections between how your culture is of value to your education. There's a lot of messages that students receive about your culture as being detrimental to your education, but she says, if it wasn't for our culture and traditions, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be a college student. And so this is an example of how the students are able to kind of piece these oral histories together, and then they all did a family artifact, which was really a cool thing too. So the last example I'm going to show is the example of our Council of Youth Research and work that I have been, as Caroline was saying, I've been directing this program for 12 years at LA, where we bring students from East LA, South Central, and Watts through 6 schools. We're in 5 now, but we have been in 6. They work with teachers. They work at their school site. We bring them together during the summer. They investigate issues in their community. They go all over the country to present. They present it to the Secretary of Education, the Mayor of Los Angeles. They've gone to the state capitol and talked to legislators. We're trying to get them to DC. They've spoken to national organizations of researchers. They've done professional development with teachers in their schools. And as the person was saying last night about his students, we have 100% graduation rate, 100% college going rate, 12 years in this program with these students. And so I'm going to show a video that I know works because it's not connected to my PowerPoint. So I did have one backup. But unfortunately, this is one about the students and not one created by the students. So you saw a clip of one that was created by the students, but this is about the students.
This summer, 28 students in the Los Angeles Unified School District traveled to Capitol Hill in Sacramento, the hub of political activity in California, to speak to politicians and Superintendent Jack O'Connell about the state's current budget deficit that has made a lasting impact on the state of education in California.
We go out and we research how to improve the education in the state of California. So on August 6th, we're going to have a presentation at the Los Angeles City Hall, and we're going to inform them about all our research, what we found out, and we're going to honor their voices to be heard, make change, and empower our education, because that's what we deserve.
These students make up the 2010-2011 Council of Youth Research, a decade-long partnership between UCLA IDEA and Los Angeles High School, in which high school students learn graduate-level research methods in order to conduct original statewide research on educational issues.
You had all of these neighborhoods in Los Angeles whose families were paying taxes for the University of California, but they didn't have access to the University of California. And at the time we were talking about it as an issue of taxation without representation. So they set aside a pot of money for outreach programs that would increase attention to and access to the university. And we started the program under 2 premises. One, we wanted to show that with the right kind of learning environment, that students were capable of doing college level work. So we weren't just trying to save a few people from a sinking ship. We actually wanted to plug up the ship. And we felt that if you included young people's voices in conversations about education reform, that it would actually lead to better education reform.
Well, a lot of inequalities would probably be like access to resources. It would probably be a big thing, because like we went to like okay, we went to Beverly Hills High School and like they just got a brand new science building, and like at schools like Crenshaw, Manual Arts, like they're probably like struggling to like get a use of a good copy machine. You know, they just got a new science building. So what is that kind of telling you? You know, it's just I just think, you know, money is like being like put in the wrong places. You know, who need the most like get more than those who need.
It's important because many people take us young people for granted because they're like, oh, they're just kids, you know, they don't know much about life. It's good to conduct research to prove them wrong, that you know that we actually do know what's going on. And also because we the students, we live in the area, we live in the community, so we know what's going on. Oh, let's pretend we're a perfect school. So they come and check and they're like, oh, everything's okay, or oh my God, everything's bad, it's ghetto. We live there every day and we know what's going on.
So college access is partly about academic preparation. So at the micro level, we've got the kids that are in the seminar in any given year, or the youth council, but the teachers that represent the schools that we work with. How do you improve instruction, and how can instruction improve access?
I have a history teacher who's very connected to like what's happening like right now. For example, she'll get like song lyrics of the hits that are right now going on and they're popular, and she relates it to what we're learning and how that like, and it makes it more interesting for us. Like, we actually want to learn about it because we're familiar with it. It's not just something that happened like 100 years ago and we're like just learning about it. And some students are not, they don't even want to learn about it because they're like, what do we care if it's like 100 years? It's not happening now, so why is it important to us? And she's always finding ways in which we can connect to what's going on, but at the same time learning the past history and how that was important back then also, and why we should learn it.
You could always like send in an adult, you know, do like a 2-day evaluation, come up with this inclusion, you know. But like if you have a student like that actually attends the school, and you know they deal with it, they're an expert at their own education, they know what they need, they know what like their peers need, you know. So I think it's important that, you know, us as youth are doing this is because the simple fact that, you know, we understand what we need, we know what we want and what we need as, you know, as students and as a school.
Right, and if anyone wants access to that video, we have a ton of videos that have been done by the students and on the students, and I can share those with you as well. So I just want to talk a little bit about the work in this project. Young people confront social issues. You've kind of seen that in the video. And we look at the different kinds of literacy development that are happening when they're critically investigating their communities. We've begun to do this kind of work in classrooms, and I know there are several classrooms in Boston that are doing this kind of work with young people as action researchers as part of their English curriculum or their humanities curriculum. Oh, here was the video, Schooled on Watts. I bet it, I just want to like see if it works. All right, see, there's some kind of like conspiracy against me showing this video. But the academic literacy development, the kind of writing the students do, this is a letter that a third grader wrote about research that they did. She wrote this letter to the assistant superintendent. You know, we did these interviews, right? So students are writing these kinds of advocacy letters. They're writing policy briefs. You saw the blogs that they wrote. They write research reports. They organize protest, right? These are fifth graders that organized a protest against the ice cream man because he was selling toy guns in the community, right? So they create an assembly. This is from a local newspaper, right? And they ended up, you know, banishing the ice cream man from the neighborhood, which was good for a couple of reasons, right? It was good for their teeth and bodies, as well as not having toy guns sold, right? We look at, like I said, at the process writing genres. These are our students in LA conducting surveys, but you can see under the young man's arm the Meet notebook. So note-taking is an important skill for writing. So we teach them how to take notes, whether they're transcribing interviews or notes in a conversation or notes like the kinds of notes that many of you are jotting down right now. We give them composition notebooks. They do field notes. They transcribe interviews. And so at the end of when we have our intensive summer component, students have written more than 100 pages of notes. Right? And we have them number the pages in their notebooks, and they can see that, you know, there's a lot of genres that I write just for myself that are important, not just the ones I share with others, like the final product, but the process genres. We have them do a lot of journaling and writing their own critical memoirs, which was the antecedent to the Critical Minds Project and Young Critical Minds, but we started with these critical memoirs, for them to tell their own story about how this process was changing their lives and their identities. And so we talked about, what that would look like and how, this writing can help you reflect on your own growth and development. This is an example from a journal entry. This one's several years ago at the Democratic National Convention. She talks about it being filled with learning experiences and learning what people had to say. It was very intense. We ended up participating in several protests during that convention. We were denied access, even though CNN was following us and they didn't want the kids in because the kids were a little bit critical of the democratic process in a city that had erected 13-foot barriers around one of the poorest neighborhoods to have this Democratic National Convention. But she ends it, these last two paragraphs are really powerful. This is a 16-year-old. She said, "Now I leave the cynicism behind, but not the anger of the first day. I will take that anger with me everywhere I go from now on, wherever that may be. It is anger that leads to action, action that changes. This place needs changes, and someone has to help achieve them. On this road, which is my life, I continue to walk ahead, going through doors and hoping to someday make positive changes. Someone I really admire said something like this: you go through doors in your life, and through some doors you just can't go back. I think the seminar as a whole has been one giant door, and I know I can never go back." Right? And research papers and presentations. Right? So I'm going to end just firing through a couple of examples of what these presentations look like without much commentary, but you can begin to see, the writing that we do in essays is important, but the kind of writing that the students do in these multimodal texts, and this is a group, both of these are research projects that were conducted in South Central LA over the past couple of years. That's where Crenshaw is. But you can see that they're incorporating pictures and other kinds of images. They're reading academic text. They're doing pretty sophisticated quantitative and qualitative analyses, right? The photos they take become text. They talk about these messages as critical research methods, interviews, surveys, observations, attending rallies and events. They create community profiles. This is one that kind of shows look at the blue and the red, and this is probably the story of many of your cities too, what they used to look like in 1960 when many of the schools were built, and what happened in 1970 with the Black and Latino population, what happened in 1980, what happened in 1990, what happened in 2000, right? And if 2010, it would just be all red and blue, and how the schools have changed and what they provide given those demographic changes. But this is a type of writing that I think we need to really consider, right? And the students put this together. It's not just some lesser form of an essay. This is its own genre that is very powerful writing that I think that we need to also give the students a chance to share. And so they're telling the story about this school, that allows these kinds of things to happen. And the interviews and the surveys showed the students really valued their education and they wanted to go to college. They had these high aspirations even with the low attainment, right? And so they talked about the graduation rates, the outside control. They were talking about connecting to history, right? They were connecting what was going on to people like Malcolm X and wanting the community to be more active in the controlling. These are some of the survey questions that they had about disengagement, but they profiled the campus where there was activism and resistance and wanted to tell this different narrative about the school, right? And these are some of the powerful programs that they saw. And they were making their demands. At the end of our presentations, they no longer make conclusions, the students make demands. Because Frederick Douglass says, power concedes nothing without a demand, it never has and never will. So they talk about the demands that they have for making change, and these are some of the students in that program. This is another one, kind of the same thing. You can see, very sophisticated kinds of understandings of research that they're putting together, very dense theories and methods that, with just one day's training, you could have your students going out and conducting interviews and transcribing those interviews and writing them up and producing very sophisticated kind of research. And this is also in South Central, and they're showing, how the freeways came in and changed this neighborhood. And again, understanding history of my neighborhood, right? They have a very good understanding now of the 50, 60-year history in their neighborhoods, and they understand the importance of historical scholarship. They've contributed to local archives. with their own historical research. And, just the real high quality of work that the students are doing in addition to the kinds of genres we normally have them do, but showing a real understanding of the research. And I think we can totally, as writing teachers, transform the nature of the research paper to not just being secondary sources, but actually having students go out and do their own research for research papers at very young ages. This is one I do want to pause on, talking about access to death. And we were in a 5-week seminar, and this was, these were all the murders that happened during the time the students were doing the research in their neighborhood, right? So we talk about literacy as a matter of life and death, and I mean that. I've said that a couple times in my writing, and I believe that, that giving students access to literacy is giving them access to additional years of their life and their families, right? So we talk about the inequality of education, the graduation rates and other sorts of things, right? But very beautiful in this text that they've written collaboratively, right? And what they feel needs to happen in terms of breaking the cycle in their community recommendations, right? Solidarity, struggle, self-determination, right? This is the kind of stuff that our students want to be doing, right? These are the kind of things that they're capable of doing when we begin to make these kinds of connections. So I want to end with a couple things. One, powerful teaching is hard work, right? We think about the skills of writing, but this is something that my teachers that I work with remind me of, that it's not about the tools, it's not about popular culture. Hip-hop does not turn a classroom around. It's you all, right? It's the love that you have for young people. It's the beauty you see inside of them. It's encouraging them every day. And that's what we need to continue to tell ourselves. They try to depersonalize education. They try to take the human element out of it. They try to take the teacher out of it. But that's what matters. Right? That's what matters to students, that they feel loved. That they feel loved every minute of the day. I have 2 children. I send to school for 6-7 hours every day, and I expect them to have love for them there. Right? I don't want there to be a gap in my kids' lives where there's not that love. Right? And it may not be an academic term, but it should be, right? And we think about the nurture, right? The love part of nurture. Second thing I want to say in conclusion is this quote, that we know that our students are powerful beyond measure, right? And as teachers too, we have this power beyond measure. Both my parents were educators, and they talk about, what better job than this for people who want to change the world? Right? Because you're changing lives. And part of the biggest gift of writing is when the students feel powerful, right? And in that video, you saw that, right? And they're like, we can do this, right? We can do this. And that to me is as powerful as anything they do. Because I know that once that identity transforms, and the rest is really the details, right? How do we help students to feel powerful beyond measure? And lastly, this quote, there's absolutely no inevitability as long as there is a willingness to contemplate what is happening, right? That the changes in our schools are not inevitable, right? The attempt to deconstruct a wonderful organization like the National Writing Project is not inevitable, right? That poor kids receive a poor education is not inevitable, right? Nothing is inevitable as long as we're willing to contemplate what is happening. My father attended segregated schools in the South. And I had a chance to speak at the 50th anniversary of Brown. And I called him, and he was in tears, and he said, I never thought this would happen, but I never gave up hope either. Right? Greater things than these have happened in history. We have to see ourselves as makers and shapers of history. Right? What kind of story do we want to write? The canvas of the future is blank. Right? Nothing is inevitable, as long as we're willing to contemplate what is happening. And finally, thank you. Right? Thank you for what you continue to do for children, even though it seems that nobody is noticing. Right? Thank you as an organization from a very personal and selfish standpoint for being there for me at an integral part of my career and shaping my philosophy of teaching and my commitment to student writing. Right? And thank you as individuals for what you will continue to do for young people. Right? Asa Hilliard says, I've never encountered any children in any group who are not geniuses. There's no mystery on how to teach them. The first thing you do is treat them like human beings. The second thing you do is love them. And I argue in closing for us to reclaim this notion of nurture as a key part of our mission, both in the technical teaching of writing, but also in nurturing young people. They're not urban people. They are young people, and each one of them is a dream. And that's our job, to continue to nurture those dreams through teaching writing. Thank you.